Have you ever been stopped at the very place you belong? Not by accident, not by mistake, but because someone decided, with one glance, that you shouldn't be there. It's a humiliation so quiet it echoes in hotel lobbies, on airplanes, even at the gates of your own home. For Darius Cole, this was supposed to be an ordinary morning, a run, a shower, coffee. But ordinary has a way of disappearing when you're black in spaces that weren't built for you. One moment you're a man returning home. The next, you're a suspect who needs to prove he deserves to exist on the other side of a gate he paid for. And maybe you know that feeling of being silently erased, reduced to a question mark in someone else's world. But here's the truth. Sometimes you don't need to raise your voice. Sometimes, standing still speaks louder than anything they expect. Because on this morning, at this gate, something happened that none of them saw coming. They thought they could block him, but then their system announced exactly who he was. Darius Cole, primary resident. Access granted. And that's when everything changed. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe dignity doesn't need permission, hit like and subscribe. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're reflections of what we live every day. Now, let's go back to that gate, the heels, the sweat, and the moment when silence became the loudest statement of all. That morning, Darius Cole wanted nothing more than quiet. 5 miles along slick, freshly paved roads, his heartbeat steady, the earthy smell of last night's rain still clinging to the asphalt. He returned as he always did, breath heavy but controlled. His workout shirt soaked through, his shoes carrying a thin coat of dust. Just a man coming home after a morning run, in a gated community he had spent nearly a decade working to claim as his own. The security gate rose before him, towering high enough to eclipse the sky. Cold steel and polished glass, programmed to recognize every movement, every breath of its residents. It wasn't just an entrance to a home, it was a statement, the declaration of a life earned. But this morning, it didn't just scan his eyes to confirm ownership, it loomed like an old, judgmental gatekeeper, daring him to prove he belonged. From the nearby guard station, a figure emerged. Clara Voss. Darius had seen her a few times enough to remember her precise stride and that unwavering, hawk-like gaze. Today, she wore a pristine white blazer, oversized sunglasses catching the early sun. Her heels struck the stone path in sharp, deliberate beats, each one like a cold punctuation mark ending any chance of small talk. Clara stopped a few paces from him. Her voice cut through the morning like a blade. The delivery entrance is closed. If you want in, use the guest gate. No greeting, no question, just an order. Darius didn't answer right away. He stood there, breath still heavy, sweat rolling down his temple to his jawline. For a brief second, he wanted to laugh. Not because what she said was funny, but because of how familiar it felt the way people always looked at him, a black man in workout clothes, carrying no visible symbols of status. In her eyes, he couldn't possibly be the owner here. A light breeze brushed his skin, as if to remind him this is your land, your house, your gate. But standing before Clara Voss, Darius understood he wasn't just facing a woman. He was entering an unspoken trial, no weapons, no jury, but judgment all the same. He raised his eyes to the gate, the sunlight reflecting off its steel like a massive mirror. And in that moment, Darius knew this wasn't about walking through a door. This was about who got to decide he belonged here. A beep sounded sharp and surgical as it cut through the air. From the overhead speaker, a cold, automated voice declared Darius Cole primary resident. Access granted. The world seemed to still. It was a sound Darius knew well, just a procedural check, part of the security system he'd invested in to protect this place. But today, the announcement was more than protocol. It was proof, a public, undeniable affirmation this was his home. Clara didn't move. Her sunglasses masked her eyes, but Darius could feel the defiance radiating from her stance. She tilted her chin up, her voice turning to ice. "Systems can be hacked. I trust my eyes more than a machine." A short sentence, but it carried a heavy accusation. Darius didn't need it spelled out. In her world. A man in sweat-stained running gear, a black man, couldn't possibly be the owner of a multi-million-dollar home inside this community. She trusted her own prejudice more than hard evidence. Darius inhaled deeply. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara's not aggressive, not submissive, just still, like a deep lake. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting, until Clara shifted slightly on her heels, a tiny movement, but enough for Darius to know she felt the weight of his gaze. There was a time Darius would have reacted differently. He would have explained himself, maybe even apologized for the confusion survival instincts of a man used to proving he belonged. But not today. Today, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The gate had already confirmed his identity. This neighborhood, these streets, every brick in this place belonged to him more than it ever would to anyone like her. The air between them thickened. The morning breeze no longer felt fresh, it carried the suffocating tension of an invisible standoff. Clara stood there as if she still held power, but her rigidity made her look smaller in that moment. A few passers-by slowed their steps. Whispers carried from a distance. Darius could feel the eyes on him, but he stayed rooted, unshaken. He wasn't the one being judged anymore. He was the one holding the line in silence. And then, amid that tension, Darius tilted his head slightly, as if to ask, "Do you really think you can stop a man at his own front gate?" He didn't speak the words, but his silence carried them louder than any sentence could. Clara crossed her arms, leaned in slightly, and delivered another blow, this one sharper, calculated to humiliate. "If you live here, where's the Bentley? Where's the driver?" The question sliced through him, not just doubting, but belittling, loud enough for the bystanders to hear. A couple walking their dog stopped to watch. A delivery driver slowed his van, pulling out his phone to record, sensing this wouldn't end like a routine exchange. Darius stayed still. He let her words settle into his skin. She wasn't just questioning him, she was publicly diminishing him, and it was happening in full view of strangers. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to purge years of swallowed anger. He knew exactly what this was. A regular morning. A simple routine coming home after a run had turned into an open-air trial. Clara stood like the prosecutor, lobbing pointed questions meant to force him to prove his worth. The spectators were the bystanders, eager for drama. And he, on his own land, had been forced into the role of the accused. In that moment, Darius thought of all the other times. Hotel lobbies where he'd been mistaken for staff. Meetings where colleagues assumed he was the assistant to his own company. And now, Clara, looking at him with that same gaze, the one that measured a person's value by the fabric on their back. But Darius wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't the younger version of himself who'd silently walk away to avoid trouble. He stood here, quiet, but not with the silence of the powerless. This was the silence of a man who knew exactly where he stood and didn't need permission to exist. Clara waited for him to defend himself, perhaps hoping for stammered excuses or frantic explanations. But Darius only met her gaze, so calm it was unsettling. That composure was what broke her patience. Her hand twitched toward the radio at her hip, ready to escalate. Darius glanced at the onlookers, their curious stares glued to the unfolding scene. He drew in one more steady breath, accepting what had become clear: this wasn't just about a gate anymore. The peaceful morning had ended the moment Clara stepped out of the guardhouse. And Darius knew whatever happened next wouldn't just be about entering his home. It would be about his right to belong. Clara pressed the radio to her lips, her voice dry and clipped. Each word deliberate, Possible impersonator at Gate 3. No hesitation. No intent to compromise. To her. This wasn't a conversation, it was a situation to neutralize. A threat she had already defined before anyone could challenge her. And she broadcasted it in the cold, official tone of authority, like handing down a preliminary verdict that Darius had no right to appeal. That sound echoed across the quiet morning streets, loud enough for a nearby delivery driver to hear. He stopped immediately, pulled out his phone, and started live streaming. The screen faced the gate. "Drama at the rich people gate," he muttered, his voice low but brimming with glee. Within seconds, comments began flooding in lines of digital chatter stacking like invisible spectators dragging their chairs into the room. Passers-by were drawn in, as if by a magnetic pull toward the source of tension. A woman in yoga gear stopped mid-stride, earbuds still in, her eyes locked on the unfolding scene. An elderly man walking his dog slowed his pace, narrowing his eyes with quiet curiosity. In just a few minutes, the once empty space before the gate had transformed into a stage. Darius saw it all but didn't move. He could feel their eyes on him, cold beams scanning his skin. Some were filming, some whispering, but none stepping close. They kept their distance far enough to be safe, close enough to enjoy the show. Clara remained at the center, as if she were directing the performance. Her voice rang out again, slower this time. Deliberate. Stand where you are. Support is on the way. Darius closed his eyes for a moment. He no longer felt like he was standing in front of his house. Every sound, every stare transformed this place into an open-air courtroom. Clara was the prosecutor. The crowd was the jury. And he on land he'd paid for had been forced into the role of the accused. In his mind, old memories surged the countless times he'd been stopped, questioned, reduced to his skin color and his presence in spaces others decided weren't for him. But this morning was different. This wasn't just suspicion, it was ritual. A public display of power, one that made people kneel by framing accusation as unquestionable truth. Darius opened his eyes and locked them on Clara. He said nothing, but in his still, deep gaze was a question. "How far will you go to keep me out?" Clara adjusted her stance, folding her arms across her chest like she was presiding over a hearing. She didn't need a microphone, but her voice carried enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Real residents don't show up in sweat-drenched shirts and gym shorts. We know what they look like." The words fell like stones into a lake, not a calm lake, but one filled with old wounds that had never fully healed. Darius stayed still, but inside, the past stirred. He remembered an afternoon years ago, still a young entrepreneur trying to carve out his name. He'd arrived to inspect the first property his company had invested in. A security guard blocked him in the lobby, ordering him to leave the client area. No questions, no willingness to listen. When Darius explained he was the investor, the guard laughed, then called a manager. That day, he stood waiting, treated like an intruder, until another executive came to confirm his identity. He remembered another night, in a luxury hotel where he owned shares, even in a tailored suit. The front desk clerk's suspicious eyes saw him not as an owner but as a wayward chauffeur who'd wandered where he didn't belong. Every memory left the same taste being diminished, reduced to someone standing outside the door, waiting for others to validate his existence. Clara kept talking, her words like a prosecutor reading out charges. The onlookers exchanged glances. A few frowned, perhaps uncomfortable with her bluntness, but most just watched silently, treating it like entertainment. Darius didn't speak, didn't justify himself, didn't ask her to stop. And that silence made the air heavier. Clara thought she held the upper hand, but in reality, she was exposing everything she truly believed, that belonging wasn't just about ownership papers, it was about looking the way she deemed acceptable. Darius lifted his head, staring at the cold steel gate. He heard his own heartbeat not from fear, but from a slow, smoldering anger. The kind forged from years of being forced to prove he deserved to stand anywhere. But he didn't let it spill over. He contained it, like a flame carefully kept inside a lantern. Clara wanted a reaction, an argument that would let her tighten her grip on control, but all she got was his silence. And in that silence, Darius remained unshaken, a statue that could be moved. The quiet stretched between them like a taut wire, fragile but humming with tension. Clara kept her stance, arms crossed, her shaded eyes locked on him as if willing her glare to pierce his calm. She didn't speak again, but every line of her face screamed, "You don't belong here." The crowd stayed put, growing by the minute. The delivery driver adjusted his phone for a better angle. A young woman whispered to a friend, "Definitely not a resident. Doesn't look like one." Each comment like a pebble thrown into the lake, rippling outward, reshaping the story in the way they wanted to believe it. And then a new voice cut through the tension. An elderly man with snow-white hair, clutching a dog's leash, walked past, shaking his head. He spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Seems like in this place, to be an owner you have to look like a magazine cover." It sounded casual, almost like an offhand remark, but in that moment, it struck like a blade. The air faltered. Then came a ripple of laughter from the crowd, first a few chuckles, then a smattering of quiet, ironic laughs. Not joyous laughter, but the bitter, tension-breaking kind. Clara flushed. The sunglasses hid her eyes, but the tight press of her lips and the slight tilt of her posture betrayed her discomfort. That comment hadn't just embarrassed her in front of Darius, it had cracked her image in front of her audience. But Clara stayed rooted, posturing in power like an actor who couldn't walk off stage even as the play unraveled. Darius glanced at the old man. For a moment, he felt seen, the truth spoken aloud, sharp but simple. He didn't laugh, didn't nod, but his gaze softened slightly, as if to say, "You said what I couldn't." The murmurs swelled. Phones rose higher. Live streams rolled on. Darius knew this had grown beyond a gate dispute. It had become public, a spectacle where everyone had a role. Clara, the gatekeeper clinging to her authority. Darius, the accused, standing trial without evidence, and the crowd, spectators, and jury, all at once. In Darius's mind, one thought surfaced: I'm used to being judged in closed rooms, but this time they want to make me an example in the open. He took a slow, steady breath, holding his ground. He knew what came next wouldn't just decide who walked through this gate. It would decide who gets to define what it means to belong. Darius didn't respond to Clara. He didn't offer a single word to defend himself against the whispers circling him. Instead, he slowed his breathing, straightened his back, and pulled a phone from the pocket of his running shorts. A small movement, but it made the air dip. The crowd hushed for a beat, waiting to see what came next. "Activate protocol. 9. His voice was low, steady, deliberate, as if he were speaking to the ground beneath his feet. Within seconds, a female voice came through the gate's built-in speakers. Not Clara, not anyone here. It was the cold, precise sound of an automated system confirmed. Overriding system. A long, sharp beep followed, and then the lights on the control panel flipped from red to green. A mechanical hum filled the air as the massive gate shuddered, waking like a giant stirred by its true owner. The crowd startled. A few people instantly raised their phones higher, eager to catch this moment on video. Clara's hands tightened into fists. She said nothing, but the tightening muscles in her face betrayed her. This was no longer a situation she could control with a few clipped commands. Darius had quietly reversed the board, not with shouting, not with argument, but with the authority built into these very walls. He stared straight ahead, not at Clara, not at the crowd. He didn't need their acknowledgement. The system had already given it to him. This gate, this neighborhood, every stone in the pavement, they all recognized who he was. Someone in the crowd whispered, just loud enough for those nearby. He just gave an order and the gate opened, so he really does live here. The murmurs spread, small waves rippling through the onlookers. Clara bit her lip, then threw out one last line, her voice flat, clinging to whatever authority she had left. The system could be remotely manipulated. We still need to verify in person. It was a lifeline, but even as she said it, it sounded hollow, like she knew she'd already lost the room. Darius stayed silent. He didn't refute her, didn't lower himself to argue. In that stillness, he became a landmark, unmoving, commanding the space without lifting his voice. Real power doesn't yell. It simply stands in its place and lets everything else orbit around it. The crowd sensed it. They no longer saw a man being interrogated at a gate. They saw a homeowner exactly where he belonged, forcing those who doubted him to wrestle with an undeniable truth. The gate rumbled again, its mechanical groan layered with the clear, electronic voice Darius Cole, primary resident. Access granted. The statement repeated like a proclamation, not to the system, but to everyone standing there. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't an intruder. He wasn't an impersonator. He was the owner. The crowd stirred. The delivery driver, still live streaming, blurted out, his voice tinged with excitement. "Y'all saw that. The gate said his name. Dude really lives here." Comments flooded his screen. A digital jury deliberating in real time, hundreds of invisible eyes watching this unfold. A woman in workout gear whispered, "If the system already verified him, why is she still blocking him?" A man nearby, arms crossed, muttered back with a trace of disdain. "Still weird, though. Who lives here and comes home dressed like that?" Their fragmented voices stitched together a chaotic quilt of suspicion and reluctant acceptance. Clara stepped back half a foot, just enough to catch herself, not enough to concede ground. Her voice rang out, hard as the concrete walls she was clinging to. The system could be compromised. You're not passing through. It wasn't just aimed at Darius, it was for the crowd. A performance to reclaim authority, to prove she still held the reins in a situation slipping from her grasp. Darius fixed his eyes on her. No blink, no flinch, no defense. The silence became unbearable. If he'd reacted, she could have escalated, but he didn't. He stood there, turning stillness into pressure she couldn't pierce. The crowd felt it too. This wasn't a man blocked at a gate anymore. It was an inversion, a gatekeeper clinging to crumbling control, and a man who said nothing yet bent the moment to his will. Clara's hand gripped her radio like a weapon, her last shred of command. But even that couldn't save her from the truth playing out in real time. The tension coiled around them, no longer about one man trying to enter his home, but about who truly gets to define belonging. Darius didn't step forward, but he didn't step back either. He let Clara hear her own words echo back, hollow against the weight of what everyone could see. And in that instant, the message was clear. Silence was no longer submission. It had become the strongest response in this open-air courtroom. No one moved. No one spoke. The space in front of the gate froze, save for the hum of a distant engine and the soft creak of the gate shifting in the breeze. Clara stayed planted, radio in hand, her authority fractured. The crowd's silence wasn't apathy. It was the kind that waits, the kind that transforms a moment into something larger than itself. Then Darius moved. One step. Small, but enough to slice through the tension like a blade. No one imagined such a simple motion could carry so much meaning. He didn't say he'd walk through. He didn't say he'd stop. He simply moved, testing the weight of this space, testing who truly owned it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a shared intake of breath at the shift in balance. Clara straightened, wound tight like a spring ready to snap, but she didn't advance, and she didn't retreat. She knew step forward, and she'd turn this into a public clash. Step back, and she'd lose in front of all these watching eyes. Darius stood still after that step, his gaze never leaving hers. No challenge, no superiority, just an unreadable calm, the kind that suffocates more than any threat could. Someone in the crowd broke the tension with a half-joke. Man's not testing his ID anymore, he's testing her patience. Laughter cracked through the air. First from the live streamer, then a few others. A scattered chuckle, but enough to shift the energy. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was theater. And the audience had turned. Clara flushed beneath her sunglasses. The laughter wasn't directed at her by name, but she knew, she felt it. It was the laughter of people witnessing power slip clumsily from one hand to another. Darius didn't laugh, he didn't react. But in his silence, everything had already been said. He didn't need to justify. He didn't need to beg. He didn't need to prove a thing. He only needed to stand there and let the truth, and his patience, do their work. One small step. One long silence. And suddenly, every eye leaned toward the man calmly standing at his own gate, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Clara clenched her jaw, then lifted the radio to her mouth. Her voice came out sharp and quick. "Unit 2, Unit 4, report to Gate 3 immediately." It didn't take long. Two uniformed figures emerged from the nearby guard post, striding toward her. One was older, his face weathered and hard as steel. The other was younger, lankier, his eyes darting nervously between Clara and Darius as if trying to make sense of the scene. Clara didn't bother with explanations. She simply pointed at Darius. "Hold him. We haven't verified his identity." The younger guard hesitated. He glanced at Darius, then at the control panel beside the gate, its green light still blinking steadily, the unmistakable signal that the system had already confirmed the resident. He swallowed hard, muttering under his breath, almost to himself, if the system already confirmed, then— "No ifs," Clara cut him off, her voice slicing the air like a blade. "I'm in charge here." That statement wasn't just for the guards. It was a declaration to everyone watching that the authority at this gate belonged to her, not to an automated system, and certainly not to the man standing calmly in front of her. Darius didn't react. He stood motionless, posture tall, gaze steady. But inside, an old, familiar feeling rose up, the sting of being dismissed. Diminished right in front of walls he'd paid for, by people paid to protect him. The crowd had grown thicker. A few onlookers called out to friends down the block, waving them over to come see what's going on. More phones were up now, their cameras trained on Darius and the guards. Whispers filtered through. "What are they even doing? He's already been confirmed." Darius heard it all, but didn't look their way. He wasn't searching for the crowd's sympathy. He knew in moments like this, the crowd could play the jury, but they were never the ones who decided justice. Clara took another step forward, planting herself directly in front of him. "You are not passing until I confirm it myself," she said, slow and deliberate, each word like a gavel strike. A long pause followed. Every eye in the crowd turned to Darius. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood this had gone far beyond a routine checkpoint. This wasn't a peaceful morning in a gated community anymore. This had become a stage, and they were all watching to see who would back down first. Darius drew in a deep breath. He didn't move, but his stillness only made Clara's impatience more visible. In that moment, everyone watching understood power here was shifting, and this confrontation was only beginning. Within 10 minutes, the quiet space in front of Gate 3 had turned into something else entirely. More walkers stopped, A few cars pulled over, drivers lowering their windows to get a better view. No one had been invited, yet the tension had pulled them in, like spectators to an unscripted play. The delivery driver, now an accidental reporter, still held his phone high. "We're live out here," he said, voice charged with excitement. "The system just confirmed this guy is a resident, but they're still blocking him. What do y'all think?" Comments flooded the screen. "Let him in. This is ridiculous. This is straight-up discrimination." The viewer count jumped from a few hundred to several thousand in seconds. Darius could hear stray fragments of conversation from the crowd. "I've seen him in a magazine. Isn't he some tech CEO?" The pieces clicked together. A few people were beginning to recognize him, but none of them dared speak up in his defense. Then a young voice cut through the thick air. A teenager in a t-shirt and shorts leaned against his bike, grinning as he called out, "Plot twist, dude built this whole neighborhood and still got to pass an IQ test to get through his own gate." The words landed, and the crowd burst into laughter. It started small, scattered chuckles, then grew into waves. Not the laughter of joy, but the kind born from absurdity too obvious to ignore. Clara stiffened. The sunglasses hid her eyes, but the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed the effort it took to hold her composure. The laughter wasn't aimed at her by name, but she knew exactly who it was about. The authority she'd been clinging to had become a punchline. Darius didn't laugh. He didn't even look at them. His gaze stayed fixed on the gate, as if the noise had nothing to do with him, but in his composure, a message was clear. He didn't need the crowd on his side. He only needed the truth. And the truth was already there, blinking green on the panel, streaming live on phones, written in the faces of every witness. Clara swallowed hard, tightening her grip on the radio like it was the last piece of authority she had left. But she didn't speak. Her silence betrayed her. She could feel the cracks forming in the wall she'd built. Darius remained still, once again, letting silence do the work. And in that silence, the confrontation had shifted. It was no longer just between him and her. It had become a public trial, and Clara was no longer the prosecutor. She was the one being judged. As the laughter died, the air grew heavier, shrinking the space between them. Clara inhaled, ready to say something to regain control, but she didn't get the chance. Darius lifted his eyes, meeting hers for the first time. The look wasn't defiant. It wasn't angry. It was calm, but heavy, like a verdict that had already been decided. "You're blocking the homeowner at his own gate." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs, through the low hum of the control panel, and dropped into the center of the crowd like a stone sinking into deep water. Clara froze. One sentence, and it stripped away everything she'd been clinging to. Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. The sunglasses hid her eyes, but her rigid shoulders betrayed her. The crowd went still. Even the live streamer fell quiet. No more snarky commentary spilling out. A couple who'd just arrived exchanged glances. Even the old man's little dog seemed to pause, sensing the shift in the air. No one spoke. All that remained was the sound of heartbeats, not just Darius's or Clara's, but of everyone standing there, pulled into the gravity of the moment. Blended with it was the soft whir of the phone's camera and the hum of the wind carrying the weight of the truth that had just been spoken. Clara looked around, meeting the crowd's gaze. Their eyes weren't just curious anymore. They carried judgment. Not of a man at a gate, but of a person trying to rebuild the invisible walls society had already worked so hard to tear down. Darius said nothing more. He didn't need to. His words had done their job, stripped the scene bare for what it was, a homeowner being treated like an intruder, on land that was his. The air was heavy, but Darius remained composed, letting the silence fight for him. The live stream kept rolling. Thousands were now watching through tiny screens, and yet no one heard noise. only the burning quiet of a verdict that didn't need to be spoken. In that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't about a gate anymore. This was about dignity. About the right to stand where you belong. And with one sentence, Darius had put everything in its place. Darius stood still at the gate, but in his mind, he was no longer in the present. This moment dragged him back to years ago, to a freezing winter afternoon when he was just a boy, following his mother to a tall building in the heart of the city. That day, his mother wore her oldest but cleanest work dress, with a fraying cardigan draped over her shoulders. She held his hand tightly as they stepped into the building's grand lobby. She had an interview for an accounting position. Darius still remembered the feeling, excitement mixed with pride, seeing his mother's name on the appointment list. But that joy never had a chance to settle. A guard, tall, imposing, stepped out to block their way. He didn't ask for her name or the purpose of their visit. He simply looked her up and down, then said, voice cold as steel, "The appointment's been canceled. Please leave." His mother tried to explain. She had an appointment. This was her chance to escape the endless grind of manual labor for pennies. But the guard only repeated himself, this time firmer, as though reading from an order, "Please leave." Darius hadn't understood it all then, but he felt the slight squeeze of his mother's hand, part apology, part reassurance. She turned without crying, without arguing. She simply walked away from the door she had hoped would open to another life. Years later, when Darius had climbed to the top of his career, he bought that very building, not because he needed another property, but because the memory of that afternoon had never faded. He wanted to make sure that door could never be slammed shut on someone like her again. Now, standing before Clara and the crowd, that memory returned sharp, suffocating. His voice cut through the morning air, slow and heavy, as if speaking not just to Clara, but to everyone who had ever questioned his presence. We have to build entire empires just to prove we belong at our own front doors. The words weren't an excuse. They were truth carved from a lifetime of trials. And in that instant, the crowd fell silent. No jokes, no murmurs. They felt the weight in every syllable, not just personal pain, but the layered history of a community, a color, a generation forced to overperform for the dignity of being seen. Darius took a deep breath. He didn't bow his head. He stood there, forcing every rejection, every doubt, to face him a man, a story, an unerasable truth. Silence pressed heavy on the space, so dense they could all hear the wind slipping through the roadside trees. Then, from behind the crowd, a woman's voice rang out, breathless but unwavering. "That's Darius Cole, CEO of ColeNet?" All heads snapped toward her. A middle-aged Latina woman in simple workout clothes, hair pulled back, water bottle in hand. She wasn't shouting for attention. She was stating a fact one everyone should have known already. The sound shattered the thick air. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Then the murmurs rose like a tide. ColeNet, the tech company. "I've seen him. He's one of the top 50 most influential business leaders in that magazine." "Yeah, that's him. I saw his photo on the cover." The delivery driver on livestream immediately pinned her words to the video. "Y'all heard that CEO of ColeNet blocked at his own gate." The viewer count spiked. Comments exploded. "Unbelievable. This is blatant discrimination. Who pays these guards?" Darius remained still, his gaze locked on Clara. He didn't need to confirm it. He didn't need to explain. The truth, once spoken, did its own work, redefining his place in the eyes of everyone watching. A few people clapped. Tentative at first, then a few more joined. The applause wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It wasn't just for Darius, it was for the truth finally spoken, for a man called by his rightful name in front of the very eyes that had doubted him. Clara faltered. She tilted her head, but didn't dare remove her sunglasses. The rigid posture meant to project authority now looked like empty armor, exposing her unease. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped, because in this moment, any justification would only turn her into a farce before a crowd that was slowly shifting to Darius's side. He was no longer just a man blocked at a gate. Darius had become the story. A story being broadcast live to thousands and spreading further by the second. He took a deep, slow breath. He didn't need the applause, but he understood what it signified a turning point. It didn't erase the prejudice he'd lived with, but it signaled one thing: Clara had lost control. And for Darius, this was only the beginning. The scattered claps lingered, like sparks over tensioned ground. The Latina woman met his gaze and gave a small nod, as if to say, "You're not alone." Others began whispering no longer suspicious murmurs, but furious remarks, blocking a homeowner seriously. "This is unacceptable." Darius stood motionless, but he was no longer a man being cornered at a gate. The truth of who he was, spoken aloud and amplified through live streams, had shifted the balance. He no longer needed to prove he belonged. Now, Clara had to prove she had the right to stand in the place she was trying to defend. Darius slowly turned his head, his gaze still locked on Clara. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence work, let her feel the weight of the eyes on her, let her realize that every wall she'd built was crumbling. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice deep, deliberate, each word carved in stone. "You just called the cops on the very homeowner you work for." Nothing more needed to be said. The sentence wasn't just for Clara. It was for everyone standing there, for everyone watching through their phones, for anyone who had ever presumed they had the right to decide who belonged where. It was a simple truth, undeniable, unshakable. Clara froze. Her hand on the radio trembled, as though the weight of his words had made it too heavy to hold. For the first time since she'd walked out of the guard booth, she didn't know what to do. She wanted to respond, to reclaim the authority slipping from her fingers, but the words jammed in her throat. The crowd was silent. The earlier noise vanished, replaced by a heavy stillness. Those who had laughed, whispered, commented now stood frozen, as though they'd just witnessed a verdict being handed down. Clara hadn't stepped back. She kept her spine straight, clinging to the posture of power. But what remained was just the outline of someone barely holding herself up under crushing pressure. Darius didn't need to take another step. He didn't need to raise his voice or explain. With one sentence, he'd flipped the entire scene from the accused to the one exposing exactly what this moment really was. And for Clara, the distance between control and public humiliation had never felt thinner. While Clara clung to her composure like the last piece of armor she had, Darius shifted slightly, pulling his phone from the pocket of his athletic jacket. Just one action. One tap on the screen, but it struck like an unexpected blow, forcing the entire battlefield to change. "Carla," he said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of a familiar command. "Stream the situation at Gate 3 to the internal channel. Send it to the entire board." "Confirmed, Mr. Cole." The female assistant's voice came through the speaker, not the tone of a servant, but the precise, efficient sound of machinery designed to serve real authority. Immediately, the control panel by the gate flickered. A series of cameras around the area activated, their angles automatically shifting toward the group. The entire scene, Darius, Clara, the two guards, and the onlooking crowd was being recorded and streamed directly to the residential management system. This was no longer a private altercation at a quiet neighborhood gate. It was now a public hearing. Every detail documented, every decision accountable to far more than just a handful of witnesses. The younger guard, who had stood frozen like a human shield, turned to Clara. His voice trembled slightly. "Do we proceed?" It wasn't just a request for instructions. It carried doubt and the fear of being dragged into a battle he had no authority to win. Clara snapped her head toward him, the stare behind her sunglasses sharp as a blade. "Hold position. I'm in charge here," she said, each word pressed down hard, though the steel in her voice no longer rang as firm as before. Darius observed the entire exchange like a man watching his opponent walk themselves into checkmate. No shouting, no anger, just letting his authority speak for itself. What he'd done had gone beyond defending himself. He turned this encounter into a formal hearing Clara could no longer escape. Because now, it wasn't just the crowd here watching the board, and the entire management system of the community were seeing it live. A few whispers rippled through the onlookers. "He's streaming this to the management board. She's done for. This isn't about who's right or wrong anymore. This is about who holds the power." The young guard lowered his head, avoiding Darius's gaze. He didn't know whether to keep following Clara's orders or step back to save himself. His darting eyes revealed what he couldn't say. His only way out now was through the man Clara had been trying to keep out. Darius said nothing further. He didn't need to. At this point, everything revolved around him and Clara, though still standing there, was no longer the center. Clara turned sharply to the young guard. Her voice clipped, "Disconnect the cameras. Now, not another second of this goes out." The guard hesitated, glancing at the control panel, then back at Darius. "But the system's being controlled from Central. We don't have access." "That's an order." Clara gripped her radio tighter, as if she could shove the last of her authority into the command. But the guard didn't move. He shook his head slowly. "I can't. It's under the board's jurisdiction now. Everything's being recorded." The words hit Clara like a slap, shattering what little control she thought she still had. She turned to the older, more seasoned guard, but he too didn't advance. He only said, voice low but firm, "I won't interfere with a direct command from the system. You know that." For a few seconds, Clara stood frozen. This was the first time since she'd walked out of that guard booth that no one obeyed her. The power she thought she held was being stripped away not by Darius, but by the very people who once carried out her every order. The crowd sensed the shift. The murmurs grew louder, clearer. "Let him in, yeah. He's the homeowner. Let him through." Then someone shouted, "Let him in." Like a spark, the chant spread, "Let him in, let him in." The crowd roared in unison, their voices pounding louder than any command Clara could shout. Clara stepped back not out of fear of Darius, but because she felt the ground beneath her authority slipping too quickly to catch. The people who had been silent spectators were now a force, a wave siding with the man she had tried to keep outside. Darius didn't move. He didn't need to rally the crowd. He simply let it unfold, like a man who knew he'd planted the seeds of truth and only needed to watch them bloom. Clara inhaled sharply, forcing herself upright. "Order, this isn't your business," but her voice cracked, stripped of its former weight. The crowd ignored her. They had chosen to stand with Darius not because they knew his resume, but because they saw the absurdity playing out before their eyes. Amid the chants, Darius turned toward Clara, his gaze neither cold nor kind, just a presence that demanded acknowledgement. This gate no longer belonged to her, and though she still stood there, the authority she wielded had crumbled. Above the chants, a lone voice rang out, clear enough to cut through the noise. "The gate's smarter than the gatekeeper." A brief pause, then the crowd erupted in laughter. It wasn't loud, but sharp, like a series of small knives slicing through Clara's fragile facade. The delivery driver swung his phone toward his face, repeating it for his live stream. "Did y'all hear that? The gate's smarter than the gatekeeper?" The comments flooded in, emojis and mocking remarks streaming across the screen. Clara's face went pale. The sunglasses couldn't hide the tension etched into every line of her face as she tried to hold on to what little dignity she had left. She was no longer the commanding presence. She was the image of someone stripped bare in public, with no tool left to restore her standing. Darius didn't laugh. He didn't even glance at the bystander who'd made the remark, but he understood its impact. One simple sentence laid everything bare. This gate, this system knew who he was and acknowledged his presence. The person assigned to protect it had failed to do the most basic thing, recognize its owner. Clara stepped back again, not to yield, but because her legs could no longer hold steady on ground that had once been hers. The young guard glanced at her but didn't ask for instructions this time. His eyes averted, as though siding with her now meant siding with a shadow of power that no longer existed. The crowd kept buzzing, laughter mixing with scorn. Phones remained raised, capturing every frame, Clara's every movement now recorded, no longer hers to control. This wasn't just a confrontation at a gate anymore. It had become a public trial, with every eye fixed on one person, Clara, the woman trying to fight against a truth everyone else could already see. Darius drew a slow, deep breath, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering. He didn't need to say another word. His silence was now a declaration he didn't need her permission to walk through his own gate. Clara opened her mouth, desperate to claw back some semblance of control, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew anything she said now would only drag her deeper into the humiliation she had created for herself. And in that moment, everyone understood the power had left Clara. It wasn't in the radio she clutched. It wasn't in her rigid stance. It belonged to the man still standing calm, unshaken, before the open gate that was his. Darius stepped forward not to cross the gate, but to stand closer to those who were watching. He didn't look at Clara, nor at the guards. His gaze swept across the crowd faces caught between curiosity, anger, and empathy before settling on the phone, live streaming in the delivery driver's hand. He drew a deep breath, his voice carrying just enough to ensure no one could miss it. They're not stopping me because they know who I am. They're stopping me because they don't know. And that's exactly why I built all of this. The words didn't fall like an explanation. They landed like a declaration. They weren't meant for Clara. They were meant for anyone who had ever looked at a person and presumed the right to decide where they belonged. The crowd went silent. The Latina woman nodded subtly, her fingers tightening around her water bottle. The delivery driver turned the camera fully toward Darius, whispering, "Listen up, people. Hear every word." The live stream exploded with comments. "Facts. He's speaking for all of us. This is what real power looks like." Clara said nothing. She stood behind her sunglasses, every muscle in her face rigid. Darius's words didn't just expose the situation. They stripped bare what she represented, a system where authority valued appearances over truth. Darius didn't stop. For years, he continued, his voice steady and deliberate. "We've had to work twice, 3 times as hard just to be seen for what we already are. We've had to build empires just to stand in places like this without being questioned." A few people in the crowd clapped, at first scattered, then joined by more. It wasn't a loud applause, but it carried weight. His words weren't just about him. They tapped into something deeper, a quiet pain many knew all too well. He turned toward the live-streaming phone, as if speaking to those beyond the gate. "This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's ever been stopped, doubted, treated like a stranger on ground that belongs to them." He paused. He didn't need to shout, didn't need dramatic gestures. His calmness made every word hit like stone. Clara stood frozen, forced to absorb every syllable. She had nothing to answer with, and that silence made her defeat all the more visible. And in that moment, it wasn't just the crowd who understood. The board watching on their screens knew too. The balance of power had fully shifted. Darius's declaration, quiet, unembellished, was a public verdict for all to see. Before the applause could settle, the control panel by the gate emitted a sharp beep, followed by the familiar mechanical voice, "Access privileges for manager Clara Voss have been revoked. All controls transferred to the board." Every head turned toward Clara. A moment stretched into what felt like minutes. The woman in the white blazer stood paralyzed, her hand clutching the radio like it was the last scrap of authority ripped away from her. Darius hadn't stripped her power. The very system she had wielded to control others had ended her reign. Someone in the crowd murmured, "They just stripped her authority." The whispers spread like wildfire. The delivery driver swung his camera toward the control panel. "You all see this. This is justice. Live." Comments on the stream poured in. "That's karma. This is what silent power looks like." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. The sunglasses couldn't hide the shock written across her face. She turned slightly, as if to leave, but found nowhere to go, as though even the ground refused to give her a place to stand. A voice cut through the murmurs. "Mr. Cole, how can you stay this calm, standing here, humiliated like this, and you're not angry?" Darius turned his head toward the voice. His eyes were as steady as a still lake. He didn't pause to think, didn't need to choose his words. His voice came low and clear. "Storms don't shake the foundation. They test it." In that moment, everything stopped. The phrase wasn't just an answer. It was a philosophy, a statement for everyone watching. It wasn't about how he faced Clara. It was about how he faced life itself, steady in the storm, proving his foundation could not be broken. The delivery driver nearly shouted into his phone, "Did y'all hear that storms don't shake the foundation? They test it." That's one for the books. The comments erupted like fireworks. That's a quote to live by. Frame that line. This is how a leader speaks. Clara stood behind her sunglasses, hearing it all, yet feeling utterly pushed out of the narrative. Her authority hadn't been stripped with yelling or chaos, but with a quiet, undeniable truth she had lost. Darius wasn't seeking victory. He simply stood there, embodying the very words he'd spoken. And now, not just the crowd, but everyone watching knew this storm had revealed whose foundation was truly unshakable. A single clap echoed sharp, decisive from somewhere in the crowd, then another, then more. Soon, the group gathered at the gate melded into a scattered but weighty round of applause. It wasn't for a performance. It was for consensus and acknowledgement of a verdict everyone accepted. Clara stayed rooted in place. Her high heels felt glued to the pavement. Her hand slackened, the radio dangling uselessly at her side. The sounds around her, the applause, the murmurs, the phone's recording fused into a deafening, pounding noise in her ears. But she couldn't react. No reaction could pull her out from the place of a defeated figure. Darius didn't look at her. He stood at the center, not because he wanted to be a symbol, but because that position had always been his. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He let the moment speak for itself. True power doesn't live in shouting, in uniforms, or in radios. It lives in a truth no one can deny. The applause grew more unified. A few voices shouted, "Let him in," no longer a request, but a statement: this man belongs here, and anyone stopping him is fighting the obvious. The delivery driver turned his camera on himself, narrating to thousands now watching, "This is justice, and we're seeing it live." A homeowner blocked at his own gate, and now the tables have turned. The comments flooded, "He won." Lesson for anyone abusing power. This is the moment we need more of. Clara said nothing. For the first time since she walked out of that booth, she had nothing left to hold on to. No command to give. No justification to make. She stood there, a hollow figure, abandoned by the authority she once wore like armor. The public trial had reached its verdict. No boardroom, no resolutions. The crowd, the system, and even the gate itself had spoken. Darius Cole didn't need permission to walk through what was his. He turned, saying nothing more. And in that silence, everyone understood the confrontation was over. Not with violence, not with venom, but with an undeniable truth. Darius said nothing. He simply stepped forward slow, steady. Each footfall on the stone walkway stamped a truth no one could erase. This was his home, and he needed no permission to cross its gate. The gate opened wide, the motor humming its familiar rhythm, the green light on the panel flashing like a quiet welcome home. But Darius paid no mind to these details. He didn't glance at the cameras, nor at the phones still held high. He didn't need to. This moment wasn't for proving anything to the world. It was for affirming something to himself. Everything he had built was never meant to stand idle as decoration. It existed to protect the right to belong for people like him. The crowd fell silent. The chatter, the chance of "let him in" faded, replaced by something heavier, a deeper, denser quiet. They were no longer spectators watching a scene unfold. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a moment where power was redefined not by shouting or force, but by the calm presence of a man walking on ground that was his. Darius didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew Clara was still there, frozen behind her sunglasses, flanked by two guards now mute as statues. He knew the people recording hadn't stopped, but he also knew that if he turned around, he'd be giving that moment life again, a moment that had already ended when the gate opened. Each step erased the doubt, the scrutiny, the sting of every questioning glance he'd endured since this began, just like years ago, when he first walked through the doors of the building that had once turned his mother away. He understood sometimes victory isn't in the cheering. It's in the absolute stillness when you finally stand where the world once tried to keep you out. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He doesn't need to say anything else." And that was the truth. Darius left no final statement, no bow, no gesture. His calm was his closing argument. As he climbed the steps onto the stone pathway, he felt the breeze moving through the trees, the morning sunlight settling on his shoulders. It wasn't a triumphant glow, it was peace. The peace of a man who had walked through the invisible wall between judged and recognized. The crowd stayed put, no one leaving right away. They didn't clap, didn't cheer, but they knew they had witnessed something that didn't just belong to Darius Cole. It belonged to everyone who had ever been questioned for simply existing. The gate closed behind him, sealing him off from the murmurs outside. Inside, the stillness was so complete he could hear his own footsteps echoing against the cool stone floor. Light from the tall windows spilled across the grand foyer, casting a soft gold over everything: the spiral ebony staircase, the intricate Persian rugs, and at the center of the far wall his mother's portrait. Darius stopped. The photo had been taken one Sunday years ago, when the two of them dressed their best for church. She wore a simple navy dress, a Bible tucked in one arm, the other hand resting at her waist, her gaze fixed on the camera, fixed on life. It wasn't the posture of someone seeking approval, it was the posture of someone who knew her worth, even when the world refused to see it. He remembered that winter afternoon, how she'd been turned away at the door of that building he now owned. He remembered her hand clutching his, warm and steady, as she quietly walked away. No arguments, no pleading, just a silent retreat, bitter in its dignity, from a door that was never meant to open for her. Now, he stood in a house he had built, with doors that opened only by his belonging, not by anyone's permission. He lifted his head, meeting her gaze in the portrait as if speaking to her. "I built all of this, not to be seen. I built it so we could never be erased." He didn't speak the words aloud, but they reverberated in his chest like a vow, an answer to every question that had weighed on his life: why he worked twice as hard, why he endured the stairs, why he kept walking through doors that had been slammed in his face. He understood he hadn't built his career, his company, his home to impress. He built them to exist beyond erasure, so that when someone stood at the gate and wondered who he was, the answer would radiate from every brick and beam: "I belong here, and no one can take that away." Darius closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory of his mother and the years of struggle fold into the present. Then he opened them, breathing in deeply. No anger, no bitterness, only certainty that this journey was never just his own. He turned away from the portrait, walking toward the garden doors as the morning light streamed in behind him. A quiet reminder, every door that once shut in his face had been opened, and this time they would never close. Darius stopped at the end of the hall, in front of the glass doors leading to the back garden. Morning light stretched across the wooden floor like a golden path. He closed his eyes, listening to the stillness. No more chatter, no more chants, just the sound of his own breathing. He turned his head for one last look at his mother's portrait. Her eyes seemed to peer through him. Through the years they'd endured the humiliation, the moments of being stopped at doors that never opened. Those eyes didn't judge or console. They seemed to ask one question: have you finished the journey? He stepped closer, placed a hand on the wooden frame. His voice came out barely louder than a whisper. Mama. Today, I didn't bow my head. It wasn't just for her, it was for himself, for the boy who once held her hand outside that locked door, for everyone like him, those whose right to exist had ever been questioned. He dropped his hand from the frame and straightened his back, walking toward the garden. The doors opened, a breeze rushing in with the scent of grass and sunlight. No Clara, no crowd, no live stream, just him and the quiet he had spent a lifetime earning. Darius stood at the threshold, drawing a long breath. He knew this wasn't the last battle. There would be more gates, more stairs, more judgments ahead. But today, he had crossed a gate that mattered not by ownership, but by resolve. He thought of those watching through their screens, those standing outside. Maybe they'd forget the details of the confrontation. Maybe they wouldn't remember every word he spoke. But he hoped they'd remember one thing: no one grants you the right to exist. You claim it yourself. Darius walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him. No slamming, no dramatic proclamations, just a simple, certain ending. Outside, the crowd began to disperse, but for those who witnessed it, the moment stayed. They had seen a man who didn't need to shout to be acknowledged, a man who stood firm in the face of judgment and walked through his own gate. And in the quiet of his home, one final truth echoed in Darius's mind, a message for anyone who had ever been forced to stand outside. Presence is not given, it is claimed. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.